Today I'm going to show you how to create this entire animated Rubik's Cube page inside of HTML and CSS. We have our logo at the left, while we have our navigation bar at the right. We have this cool hover effect right here, as well as a heading, an animated Rubik Cube and some text to the left and to the right, as well as our social icons at the left bottom. So let's go, guys. So the GitHub link for the images and the entire project will be in the description. So if you want to use the exact same images, feel free to go and click on the GitHub link in the description and download the images folder. First of all, we are going to create our index.html file as well as our style.css file, because those are the files that we are going to need. Inside of the index.html, we are going to generate a basic template, and we can give our website a title like Rubik Cubes, for example. Now, first of all, let's define the basic structure of our website by using a header as well as a main container and a footer. Inside of our header, we are going to have a div that wraps two other divs. The first div contains the text for the logo, and the second div contains our navigation bar. And inside of this nav bar, we have an anchor tag, and the first anchor tag obviously goes back to our home page, so to our initial page, and it says home. Now we can create multiple other anchor tags, and the second anchor tag can say our mission, for example. The third one can say team, and the fourth one could say contact, for example. So this is the structure of our navigation bar. I'm also going to open our index.html with the live server so we can see it. And this is what our website looks like. So let's start styling our website. First of all, let's link our style sheet by using link:/CSS and linking our style.css file. Instead of our CSS file, let's first use the universal selector to give our document a margin of 0 pixels, a padding of 0 pixels, and box sizing of border box. Now let's also target our header, and let's give our header this background color. Feel free to just copy this background color. I really experimented a lot and tried to find one that looks pretty good, so feel free to just copy those colors and go ahead. Now we will also use a width of 100% and a height of 100% of the viewport height. So we're basically using the entire viewport. And we have this result. Obviously this here looks pretty terrible, so we're going to change that one next. So let's go ahead and create a class that says white, and we'll give that class the color of white. Next up, we're going to create a class that says font-XL, and that class has a font size of 40 pixels. And let's create a class that says .bold, which creates a font weight of bold. And now let's use those classes to style our logo. So we are going to give that class the class white to create white text, bold to create bold text, as well as font-XL to create a larger font. And now we have this result. Also, let's start to incorporate a different font by going to Google Fonts Roboto, and we're going to get Roboto for this project. So we're going to the website, we're going to click get font to get the font, get embedded code. Now we have to embed those links inside of our header in the index.html file to use this font in our project. And now we can use the font by using font family Roboto inside of our style sheet, and we are going to use it inside of our entire body. So we'll define it here. And this is the result of the font we are using right now. So let's also go ahead and style our navigation links by using the class .white as well as .underline none, because right now our text is underlined and we definitely don't want any kind of form of text decoration. So we're going to use text decoration none to get rid of the underline. And now we're going to give our anchor text the class of underline -none as well as white. So we have white anchor text like this. So let's just go ahead and copy those classes and give those classes to our second and third and fourth anchor tag as well. And this is what the website now looks like. Next up, let's create a class to use a flexbox for those containers. So basically I want to have one of those classes at the left, right here, and I want to have the nav bar at the right here. So we're going to create a flexbox to create a separation. So we use .flex to create display of flex, and we're going to use or create a class that has the name justify between to create justify content space between. like so. And now we can go here and say, let's give this div the class of flex and justify between. And now we're going to save the document and we have this result. So all of our tags are right here, or our nav links, and our logo is at the left. Let's also use or create the class items minus center to align items center. We're going to copy this class and we give our navbar the item center class as well. And now we have this result, which is a lot better already. So now let's also give our anchor text some form of padding. So we can create a padding to the left, so on the x-axis, and to the right, and to the top and to the bottom, so on the y-axis. So let's, for example, say we want to have .py of, for example, 1, which says padding top of 10 pixels and padding bottom of 10 pixels. And we're going to do the same for the x-axis by saying .px minus 2, for example. So let's say padding left 20 pixels, padding right 20 pixels. And now let's use px2 and px1 for this nav leg, and py1, so py1, px2, and we're going to save the document. And now we have this padding basically. And now let's use those classes for the other links as well to get some more padding. And you'll see why we are using padding instead of a gap in a second. And now we basically have this contact form. Now I also want to have some padding to the top and bottom and left and right for the entire top bar, if you want to say so. So let's go ahead and say, okay, let's generate py of 4, for example. I just want to take a look at the style and how it looks once we apply it. So let's use py4. Maybe this is a little bit too much, but we'll see in a second. And I want to have py of 4 for the entire top bar. And now we have a little bit of space, but actually this is probably a little bit too much. So I'm going to go with py2 and let's say 20 pixels top bottom, 20 pixels bottom, like so. And now we use py2 and this looks a lot better already. Let's use px4 though, and I think this could look pretty good. So let's go right here and replace 20 pixels with 40 pixels. And we are going to use px of 4. And now this is what our navbar looks like. And I think this looks pretty cool already. Now there's another thing that we can do. And the first thing I want to do is basically give the active class, so basically our index.html, with the href of index.html background. And we can do so by using nav a brackets, and inside of the brackets href equals index.html. So we're going to target every nav link inside of an anchor, every anchor inside of a nav link that has the attribute href equals index.html. So that's basically our homepage, and we give this one a background of white and a border radius of maybe 30 pixels and a color of black. So we have black text on a white background, and this is what it looks like. And as you can see, it looks pretty cool already. But let's also say that once we hover over a nav link, so nav a : hover, we get the exact same style. So now it looks like this. But as you can see, we have actually no gap at all between our items. The padding makes our buttons look pretty good, but it doesn't make the space between our buttons look good. So we can also maybe say .gap -2, and this one gives a gap of 20 pixels. So let's go inside of our navbar and let's say we use the classes of flex to enable gap, and let's use gap -2 to create a gap. And now we have this gap between the items, and I think this looks pretty good. So this is what our navbar looks like for the moment, and I think this is fine. So we are going to go to the next step, which is creating our Rubik Cube with some text at the left and some text at the right. So let's go ahead and do that one. First of all, obviously we can also use a comment to say that this is our nav bar, and now we copy this comment and we go below our nav bar and say that this one here is our cube, and we are going to create another div, and inside of this div we have another div that is basically the placeholder for our text. So we can, for example, say, okay, let's have an h2 here that says we are making the best cubes, and a paragraph that has maybe 30 words, like so. Now, between this div and the exact same div for now, since we keep this as a placeholder, we want to have a cube. And I show you what this looks like. So we're going to use an div, and inside of this div we keep an image, and this image is pointing to our images folder and to our cube.png. And this might look terrible for now, but we're going to style this later on. But as you can see, we have a div on the top, a cube in the center, and another div at the bottom. So the first thing I want to do is create a grid. And we are going to use a grid instead of a flexbox because this makes it slightly more responsive, but it doesn't really matter too much. But yeah, for now we are going to create .grid as a class and set display to grid. Now the next thing we are going to do is .grid auto, or create a class .grid auto, which will have grid template columns. Repeat, because we want to repeat the columns a certain amount of times. We are going to use autofit to create as many columns as necessary, and we create min max to define a min and a max value of 250 pixels and 1 fr. So if space is available, take up one fraction of the available space. Once you get to 250 pixels, just wrap the items into the next row, which makes this grid extremely responsive. And we will use this class a couple of times during this project, so this one is really important. So let's go inside of our div, our container div, and say we want to have a class of grid auto. And now we should have those items spaced next to each other. Now I also want to create another class that says .grid minus center, and we're going to use place minus items, and we use center to center our items. So now let's first of all target our cube by creating .cube as a class, and we say we want to have a width of maybe 500 pixels. So let's go to our Rubik Cube, or to be precise to our image, and let's say class equals cube, which is the class we've created right here, and by doing so we set the width to 500 pixels. Maybe we should go with 300 pixels, and now we see that this basically affects our cube. Maybe 400 is slightly better. And yeah, maybe 300 was better. So we're going to go with 300 pixels. So now let's also center align our items by using grid center, which places our items inside of the center of the grid. And we give our grid the class grid center. And now all of our items are centered. Basically, it still doesn't look too good. So the next thing we are going to do is basically make sure that our entire container just takes up 80% of the available space, because I don't want the text to be so close to the left and to the right. And we can do so by creating another class that says .w minus 80, and we'll say we want to have a width of 80% right here. And now we are going to go to our grid and say w minus 80 to create a grid that just takes up 80% of the space, but now we also need to center it. And we can do so by creating another wrapper container around our grid, and say that this wrapper container has a class of flex and justify minus center. We don't have justify center yet as far as I know, so we're going to create that class right between justify between, and we say .justify minus center, and we create justify content of center. And this should center our items, as you can see. So the next thing we want to do, maybe we should also center align our items. So we're going to use item center as well, just to make sure that they are centered by doing so. And now we also want to have white text, and maybe want to have some spacing between this paragraph and this heading. So first of all, we can obviously go into our grid and say that we want to use white for the exact entire container, and now our entire container is basically white. Maybe we should also add some margin to the top, so we probably have to create this class by using .mt1 for example, and let's say we want to have a margin top of 10 pixels. And now we use this mt1 class for our paragraphs, and I'm going to copy the exact same class and give this to our second paragraph as well. And now we have some margin basically right here. And maybe this text is aligned perfectly fine, but this text should maybe be aligned to the right, for example. So it should go from right to left. And we can do so by creating classes. Let's create the class text minus center, which uses text align to center. Let's also create dot text right to text align to the right, because we will probably need text center later on, so I'm going to create it right now. So let's go to our first div probably and say that we want to use the class text minus right. And now our text should be aligned to the right, as you can see, and this works perfectly fine. Now another thing that we should add is probably an animation to our Rubik Cube, because like this it looks pretty boring. So I think animating that one would be pretty cool. So we give our cube class basically an animation, and we can do so by first of all obviously creating our animation by using keyframes identifier. Let's use the class float, and let's create an animation from 0% to 25% to 50% to 75% to 100%. And obviously first of all let's start by using transform of translate of maybe 0 pixels and rotate of maybe, let's use 0 degrees. Doesn't really matter though. And we're obviously going to use the same transform property for the last keyframe, because it should basically end where it starts. So now for 25% we can for example say, okay, translate 20 pixels on the y-axis. So we're going to use translate y right here. And let's say we want to rotate by maybe 7 degrees. Now we copy this one and we say we want to translate to -4. Now we want to translate to 3 degrees, for example. And right here we are saying we're going up. Now we're maybe going down to -10 pixels. Now we're going up to 20 again, or let's say we're going down to -30, now we're going up to 10, and now we have this rotation. And now we're going to use this animation. We'll see how it looks. We can obviously adjust it later on, but for now let's just test this animation by using animation float. We want a time of maybe 20 seconds, ease in out, and we want to use infinite so it loops forever. And now let's take a look at our cube, and this is what our cube now looks like. It's basically rotating. Now it's going upwards once again. It's obviously also rotating when it goes upwards. Now it goes downwards again, and so on. And this will basically loop forever and ever and ever. And if you want to create more complex animations, you can obviously do so. You can be creative there, but this would obviously take a lot of testing and a lot of trial and error. And for the purpose of this tutorial, I think you definitely know how this works and how this can look like. So yeah, let's go ahead and keep adding a heading, an H1 to our website that basically tells the viewer immediately what the website is about. So let's go ahead and right above our cube, I want to have an H1 that says best Rubik cubes you get, or Rubik cubes 2K25, which would probably look pretty cool. And now we obviously need to use a class that says that this is white. Text minus center can be used here as well. So now our text is centered. Let's create a much bigger text though by creating another font class, which is probably font minus XXL. We use 80 pixels right here, and we use font minus XXL for our H1. And now we have this heading. Now maybe it's also pretty cool to have some margin top, some margin bottom. So I'm going to create a class that says my.my. We have mt, so we are not having margin on the y-axis yet, but we can do or create one by using my -8, margin top 80 pixels, margin bottom 80 pixels. And now let's use this class of my8 for our heading, so we get some margin on the top and some margin on the bottom. And this here looks really, really good to me, to be fair. So now the last thing we basically need are those icons at the left bottom. And we can add an icon section, so we're going to use this comment once again, and we'll paste it down here and say that those are probably our socials. And we create another container to wrap our socials. Inside of this container we have an anchor tag, and inside of this anchor tag we want to use an image. That image goes to our images folder and uses the Instagram SVG. Now we are going to copy this anchor tag, we paste it twice more, and now we can remove image/Instagram and replace it with image with youtube.svg and discord.svg. And now we would have those large icons. Obviously, if you have them as an SVG, I really recommend to incorporate them as an SVG into your code. By just going into the images folder, you could obviously go to the SVG, click open with text editor and copy this code, paste it in here, and you would have the exact same result. But the reason I'm not doing this is because I want to keep the code as short and as clean as possible for you to understand. But obviously for performance purposes, this would be the better way to go. So let's go ahead and give our images the class of socials-icon. And I'm going to create a style for this socials-icon class, socials-icon. I'll give it a filter that has a brightness of 0 and invert of 1, because right now our icons are basically black, and if I invert the color and set the brightness to 0, so brightness 0 basically sets the color to black, and inverts the color from black to white, from white to black. So this one is basically what turns our icons white, and this is what I'm actually going to need for the purpose of this project. And now let's also use a width for our icons of maybe 30 pixels by doing so. And now we have those icons, and I think this looks pretty cool. So the next thing I'm going to do is create some style for a social container or socials container, which we haven't used yet, but we are going to use this class and give it to the wrapper div. So the wrapper div has the class socials container, and we use a position of absolute, but we obviously need to define the element that is basically the container that has position of relative. So we need to define the container our element can position absolute to, or can use position absolute to. And now we basically have this header, so basically the entire page, 100% of the width. And this is the position relative element, and now we are using position absolute to position our social icons relative to our header, if you want to say so, by using position absolute. And we say we want to have a bottom of 0, a left of 0, which will push our icons bottom and left to 0. And now let's give them 10 pixels of margin to the bottom, for example, and 10 pixels of margin to the left, if you want to say so. And maybe you can experiment with those values. Maybe 20 would look a little bit better because the icons would have some more space to breathe. I also want to have opacity of maybe 0.6 for those icons and see how this looks. And as you can see, this looks pretty cool. You could also use 0.4, whatever, you can experiment there. And now let's also use the class flex and maybe gap2 for those icons, which might be a little bit too much. So I'm going to create another class that is .gap1, for example, which has a gap of 10 pixels. And now I'm going to use gap1 for the icons to have proper spacing. And this is what it looks like. Obviously, you can use different gaps and whatsoever and experiment, but this is how you would create this cool animated logo cube page in HTML and CSS.